Recording. Okay. So I decided to make the topic for today's class the war in Ukraine. Um, so obviously this is an ongoing conflict. It started a few years ago. It's still ongoing today. Obviously, as we know with the news cycle, it's something that has had less international attention, but it's something that, the consequences and the effects of which still affect the people in Ukraine to a very, very large extent today. So that's to say, even though the conflict has been going on for a few years and it hasn't ended yet, and it's not clear when it will necessarily end, it's still an important topic for us to gain a good understanding of. So if you guys were here for the very, very first class of this school year, then you will know that we briefly touched on the war in Ukraine and we discussed a few things about it, like the causes and the effects and the current state of the war. But we're just going to go more comprehensively into that in today's discussion. So try not to be repetitive. We'll have some new discussion prompts. We'll open up the discussion to all of you guys to hear your opinions on this. So let's get into it. So here are some important questions. I'm not going to read through all of them. But broadly, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the history of Ukraine, kind of the current situation of the war, and the potential solutions or ways to kind of reduce the impact of the conflict. So we're going to start with just a brief kind of history slash overview of Ukraine. Now, I'll open it up to you guys. What do we know about Ukraine? Just you can give me anything like what is Ukraine? Like, is it a state? Is it a city? Is it what is it? What's its history? How did it come about? What do we know?
Its flag is blue, bright blue and yellow. Its country, it used to be part of the Soviet Union before it fell apart. Right now it's in war against Russia. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good, Andrew. Ethan, I saw you had your hand up as well.
You already answered my question, like what I was gonna say.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, yeah, I'm just looking for anything that you know about Ukraine. Doesn't necessarily have to be one right answer. Does anyone else want to add anything? They know? Alina?
I know that Ukraine is basically, it was it belonged to the USSR before. After the Second World War ended, they split off, and apparently the war between Ukraine and Russia started because Ukraine was saying that the Russian government was mistreating their citizens in Russia, and they wanted their citizens to have a better life in Russia.
Yeah, for sure. I think that could be one of the causes of the war for sure. I mean, we will also probably get into the other causes of the war. Maybe we'll briefly touch on that, just so we have a bit of context, knowing how, 2021, the 2021 conflict began. But yeah, that's really good, Alina. Anyone else have anything to add? Okay, well, fantastic start. Seems like most of you guys are quite knowledgeable Ukraine. So we'll go through a brief history. Like some of you guys mentioned, Ukraine is an independent nation. It's a sovereign nation, has control over its own borders right now, but that wasn't always the case, right? So Ukraine's independence first really came about 30 years ago, but even before then, it was part of the broader Soviet Union, which was primarily Russia and a bunch of other Eastern European states that it had annexed, right, which it had full control over. Um, but maybe we'll go all the way to kind of when the idea of Ukraine started to form. So going back all the way over 100 years ago in 1917, there was an attempt at revolution, essentially, right? So Ukraine had an attempt at revolution. This did not obviously go successfully, and then it was annexed by Russia, and then World War II happened. After World War II, Soviets were on the winning side of the war, so they were able to keep a lot of their territories. I'm sure everyone knows about World War II and how that ended up, so I don't think I need to explain that too much. But eventually, then we know, and this is maybe going more into the Cold War history, right? Is that in 1991, the Soviet Union finally dissolved, right? There's a lot of internal conflict within the states within the Soviet Union. A lot of the states desired independence, but at that point in time, the Soviet Union was also incredibly weak politically. Its government was changing a lot, so there were a lot of new leaders coming in. And I think at the point at which I don't know who it was specifically who agreed to finally dissolve the Soviet Union into its member states because it was just too much work to try to keep it all in one piece. So at that point, 1991, that's when Ukraine gained independence. And of course, with that, they were able to establish their own borders. They were able to elect their own government and their leaders. They were also able to get this cool flag, which Andrew described to us, right? It's the blue and the yellow flag. Very, very nice. So they gained independence on August 24th, 1991. Now, interestingly, despite Ukraine gaining its independence, right, it doesn't mean that all of the problems in Ukraine just magically disappeared and they were able to be solved. So, uh, you know, just because Russia had been respecting Ukraine as an independent state didn't mean that there was still tension brewing, that there was the potential conflict to occur. So, one of those such conflicts occurred in the Ukrainian region known as Crimea. Does anyone know what happened in Crimea and when this kind of conflict within Crimea occurred? Anyone? Okay, so give a bit of context. And I think this is really important to talk about because the events that happened in Crimea kind of set the stage for the 2021 full-scale invasion of Ukraine in its entirety. So after the Soviet Union dissolved, right? Again, the leadership changed a lot. But nowadays, we know that the leader of Russia is Putin. He's a pretty big and bad dictator who's been in power for decades. But the main thing to note is that Putin was the one in power in 2008 when Russia tried to send, well, they sent troops into the eastern region of Ukraine known as the Crimea and occupied it, right? And do we know the reason? Does anyone know the reason for why Putin sent troops to this part of Ukraine to occupy it? What do you guys think? I think this is actually something that we could probably reasonably guess. Think about the history of the Soviet Union. Ethan?
I think they're trying to take back Ukraine
Yeah, and why do they think, or why do they think they have a claim to take back this part of Ukraine?
because they were also part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so they were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Good. And so if in the past, like in the past 20 years, they were part of the Soviet Union, what does that mean about the people living in this region of Ukraine? What does that mean about the people living in Crimea? What do you think that could mean?
They were part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, they were part of the Soviet Union, and a lot of the Soviet Union, or a lot of the people in the Soviet Union were ethnically Russians, right? So, yeah, Andrew?
I think it has to do with loyalty. Maybe the people in Crimea are more loyal to Russia than Ukraine, so they would not fight back as much.
Yeah, for sure. I think loyalty is also a big part of it. There are a lot of ethnic Russians still living, or like the history of the people living in Crimea, it's pretty dominantly Russian, right? There's still to this day a lot of people who have Russian kind of histories, Russian ancestors who live in Crimea. So the justification that Putin basically gave for why he sent, thousands of soldiers and troops to occupy Crimea is like, look, the people of Crimea, they want to be part of Russia, right? Or they want to be part of their own independent state. So what we're doing is we're just liberating Crimea from Ukraine because right now, Ukraine is like oppressing these people and they want to be free. They want to be their own kind of territory, right? Um, and so after they invaded Crimea, they also like forced the area to hold a vote. And some people think this vote was legitimate, others think that this vote was definitely not legitimate. But in the vote, the people of Crimea voted to kind of uh, move away from. They expressed that they wanted to go away from Ukraine and form their own independent state. Okay, so regardless of whether this was like a fair thing for Russia to do, right? Like whether this was legitimate, whether these people really did want to create their own state. Um, Other than that, right? Like the rules of the international law are that you cannot just invade another country and send soldiers there to take it over without that country allowing to do so. So obviously, this was like really, really bad, and the other countries tried to punish Russia for this, especially the United States. They put really, really heavy sanctions on Russia as a result of this. Everyone knows what sanctions are, right? Just checking. Someone tell me what sanction is.
No,
Okay,
It's
Andrew.
like it's like when you kind of either stop trading with them or sell it at a much higher price than you normally would to try to wear down their economy because they did something that you don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it could look like is, let's say the United States trades with Russia, and Russia sells a lot of oil. Russia has a lot of oil, so they're one of the world's biggest oil sellers to other countries. If the United States wants to damage Russia's economy, what they can do is either they can say, "Hey, we're just not going to trade. We're not going to buy your oil from you," right? And that means Russia doesn't make money selling its oil. When the United States can say, "Well, look, we'll still buy your oil, but we're going to make you you're going to have to sell it to us at a much lower price. So you're going to impose some sort of, it's known as a tariff, that's going to still damage your economy, but still allow us to buy the oil from you if you really want. So these sorts of actions were to try to punish Russia and to kind of like tell it like, if you keep doing these kinds of things, or if you don't leave Crimea, we're just going to continue doing this to you. Obviously, this wasn't effective because to this day, well, I mean, leading up to the actual invasion, Crimea was still occupied by Russia. So clearly, in the 13 or so years that these sanctions were taking place, it wasn't enough of a threat to make Putin, leave Crimea and to take his soldiers away from Crimea. Now, why do you think this was a really important event that kind of played a big factor leading up to the invasion, the full-on invasion of Ukraine in 2021? I hinted that this was a major event. Why was this such a big tipping point for the actual invasion? What do you guys think? Okay, so if I'm Putin and in 2008, I sent a bunch of troops to invade this one region of Ukraine, and no one was able to really stand up to me or tell me to be able to stop successfully, why might that, cause me or not cause me to do certain things in later on in regards to Ukraine?
Maybe you think it's like easier to invade because no one is actually doing anything about it. Maybe you'll think it'll go unnoticed. Uh, I don't know.
I think, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at there, Andrew, right? So it's the fact that Putin had already a lot of success with invading Crimea. A lot of other countries put sanctions on Putin, but Russia's economy was still doing all right? So at the point at which in 2021, Putin was like, well, I really don't like Ukraine. What if we just invaded the rest of Ukraine, right? He probably thought, well, no one's going to really stand up to me. They're not going to react in a big way, right? Because they don't really want to start anything with us, with Russia, because we're such a big and powerful country in the world. And so in 2021, indeed, the invasion does happen, right? And this was a much larger scale invasion. So as opposed to the tens of thousands of soldiers that Putin sent to occupy that one small area, or not one small area, but like one partial area of Ukraine, of the Crimea, Putin now sends hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He basically forces the citizens of Russia to sign up as soldiers, so he conscripts them, right? There's partial mobilization of the Russian population, and they send the full might of their military equipment and weapons and troops to try to invade the whole of Ukraine. Okay? And so we can see this is kind of what that invasion looked like. Now, I did promise we were going to talk a bit about the causes of this invasion, which I think adds a bit more important context as well into our discussion. So, based on your guys' knowledge, what do you guys think were the causes of Putin invading Ukraine? Why did he want to invade Ukraine specifically in 2021? Does anyone know the actual reasons? If not, I can also see there are many reasons you could probably figure out based on the history of Ukraine and the Soviet Union that we've talked about, right? Okay, I'm gonna call on someone because I know we've had a lot of good volunteers, but they've been kind of the same students over and over again. So I'm gonna call on someone new. Maggie, what do you think was one cause for why Putin invaded Ukraine?
I think one cause would be that he probably thinks that Ukraine should like belong to Russia again.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I think the word again there is really important, right? The way he tells his citizens this is he says, like, if you look at our history, right, our glorious Russian history, Ukraine was formerly part of the Soviet Union, so we should really take it back and kind of restore what was formerly ours. That's definitely one strong reason why Putin decided to do this. Why do you think exactly he decided to do this in 2021? What was going on in 2021 that really pushed Putin over the edge and made him want to invade? Alina?
This is just a guess, but was it the COVID pandemic?
I think that could be part of the reason. I think this is a good idea, right? I'll expand a bit more. So the COVID pandemic obviously devastated economies worldwide. And Russia is a dictatorship, which means its economy is not really good to begin with. I mean, it sells a lot of oil and a lot of other like natural resources, but because it's run by a dictator, Putin's obviously not the best leader for the country, and the economy has kind of been struggling. So with the COVID, that really devastated the country, and Putin's popularity, as you probably can guess, went down. Now, when a leader feels like their popularity in their country is going down, what's a good way for them to try to gain favor again with their citizens? What could be a possible way in which they gain more popularity in their country? Well, they can invade another country and blame it on the other country, right? So Putin, at this point, he's like, okay, well, how can I try to rally the Russian citizens to support me, to vote for me? Well, they don't really need to vote for me, like it's a dictatorship. He doesn't want them to hate him, right? So a good way we can do this is, yeah, we can spread some propaganda, like Andrew says. We can say, oh, we need to take out the terrible, terrible leaders of Ukraine. We need to take back Ukraine to Russia and restore ourselves to the former glory of the Soviet Union, basically. So I think the COVID pandemic definitely played a role in pushing Putin to do this for the sake of gaining more popularity. Good. So I'll give one final reason that I think why this happened specifically in 2021. And that was because the context in 2021 is that a lot of countries were starting at this point to try to. So there are a lot of international alliances that provide defense and military support for countries in those sorts of alliances, right? One such alliance is known as NATO. Um, and it's comprised of a lot of countries in Europe and in the Atlantic region. So the whole purpose of NATO is to kind of create this alliance, this group that would be able to fight back against Russia in case Russia decided to be aggressive towards any countries near it. So in 2021, actually, Ukraine expressed that it wanted to join NATO because previously it was kind of neutral, it wasn't part of NATO at all. But in 2021, there were rumors that Ukraine was trying to get into NATO, and this angered Russia a lot because NATO is kind of seen as Russia's enemy. And so Putin at that point, he was like, to really send a message that we don't want NATO messing with us and we don't want Ukraine to join NATO, we're going to invade Ukraine right now before it can join NATO, right? Because once Ukraine joins NATO, then Russia would never be able to invade Ukraine because by the laws of NATO, if you invade a country in NATO, you basically declare war on all countries in NATO. So that's why Russia invaded Ukraine at that point. Okay. Good. Do these explanations make sense to everyone, or am I going too fast? I hope this does make sense to you guys, so that you guys understand a bit more about how this war actually came about. Okay. Oh, we were going to talk about this, but I figured you guys were kind of stuck on this, so that's why I just decided, okay, cover it as a class. So yeah, this is what I was talking about with NATO. Okay, here's an interesting question. So, what do you think the international reaction to Russia fully invading Ukraine was? What do you think happened? Or what do you think should have happened? Alina?
I feel like a lot of the countries were really upset and mad that Russia was just like invading Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to join NATO, especially because uh, Ukraine was like really close to Russia and they had conflicts before. And so a lot of countries might have wanted to stop another war with Russia, but that would also be dangerous. So many and might lose like political powers because wars just mean more money spent. So I think a lot of countries would just like spread a lot of news that Russia was invading Ukraine and how bad it was.
Yes, absolutely, right? So this was covered widely on the news. Every single news outlet, if you remember back to February 2021, I don't know if you guys were looking at the news, but you must have heard it somewhere, right? Maybe your parents were talking about it, maybe your friends at school, maybe your teachers were discussing it. But like everyone knew about this, right? Because this was like a really big thing, right? A country invading another sovereign country. Good. Anyone else? What else do you think these other countries did in reaction to this? Andrew?
We financially supported them. People started fundraisers and uh just kind of a bunch of countries sent money, supplies. I don't know if any of them sent soldiers, but they sent military supplies, stuff like that, to try to help Ukraine without being directly involved.
Absolutely. This is a good point to make. There's a lot of financial and military support. So the reason you can't send actual soldiers to Ukraine to fight is I think I don't know if other countries would want to send their own country's men, right, to fight in a foreign war. This is oftentimes not something that citizens of a country would like to support, right? Because your men could die in those wars. I think the second and more important reason, like the United States or Britain didn't send like their own soldiers to fight in Ukraine, is you sending your own country's soldiers to fight in that war would be a declaration of war against Russia. And Russia has nuclear weapons, which means you don't want to fight Russia in a direct war. Um, Russia could use their nuclear weapons and like kill a lot of people, right? So, but you could send money to Ukraine so that Ukraine could afford to, pay its military. They could send a lot of weapons and a lot of equipment, tanks, planes. They send all of these things to Ukraine. And then for the people on the ground, right? A lot of nonprofits and humanitarian organizations, they donated millions and billions of dollars to provide things like food and shelter and emergency medical care for the people who are the innocent citizens who are being, harmed or hurt or killed in the war, right? So I think there's a lot of positive international support to Ukraine. That's good. Anyone else? What about immigration stuff? Yeah, what do you think about the immigration stuff, Maggie? What happened in terms of that?
Like ever since the war, a lot of Ukrainian people, like citizens, immigrated to other countries such as Canada.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't actually count this as immigration because it's not like they just decided like, oh, I don't really want to live in Ukraine anymore. It's more so there's a war in my country, I have to flee the violence. So we would probably call it more of like kind of a refugee situation where millions of Ukrainians suddenly became refugees and they had to flee to other countries. So many other countries, like the ones bordering Ukraine. So, for example, Poland is a really big ally of Ukraine. They accepted millions of refugees. A lot of other European states, and then we had Canada. In Canada here, we had thousands of Ukrainian refugees fly over and kind of settle and create their own communities in Canada because they can't go back to Ukraine right now, right? The war is still going on. So really good immigration or slash migration, I would say here. It's more accurate. And then I know we also talked about sanctions, right? In 2008, when Russia invaded Crimea, there were sanctions. Undoubtedly, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion in 2021, there were also sanctions. These sanctions were also a lot more strict, right? A lot more powerful against Russia. But even today, right, the sanctions weren't that effective because clearly Russia still has the money to continue funding its war. That's why the war is still going on today. So military support, military aid, we've talked about this. Here's an interesting topic, and this is kind of more your personal opinion. So we know that right now, the facts as they stand are that many foreign countries have supplied a lot of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. But some people think that their countries shouldn't be spending taxpayer dollars to buy weapons and send to Ukraine. They should be using their own country's money in their budget to do things that benefit their own citizens. So let's have a discussion about this. Should foreign countries continue to supply more weapons and equipment to Ukraine or not? Someone start us off with their take on this. Okay, Lucas, what do you think?
Um, I don't think they should supply more to Ukraine because, I mean, if you're already doing some, and if some people aren't very happy that you're not spending the money, the tax on like improving your situation, you might not get revoted again.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing can be this idea of clash and like opinion going against you because you're spending too much money, you're spending even more money funding Ukraine instead of helping your own citizens. Lena, what do you think?
I think they should, mostly because already a lot of richer countries, a lot of monies go to the officials and the people who run the government, especially those with high status. And many times, if you just go to America with some of the richer countries, you could see that there are some cities without water or electricity, and there are many rundown hospitals who are understaffed. So I think if rich countries do not want to help their citizens, at least help the citizens in a country that are fleeing for their lives, because at least the people in the richer countries, they can have food and they won't have the fear of their house or their shelter slowly being bombed because the war moved to their zone. And many people in Ukraine, they really need the water and food just to flee from their country to a neighboring country, because even running on foot could take up to weeks to the nearby country. So many people are out there really need those to survive. And lastly, weapons can really help turn an advantage, like on give Ukraine an advantage while fighting Russia, because Ukraine is a much smaller country and Russia has a bigger government with more money. So they have more funds for weapons, and Ukraine doesn't have that many specialized weapons, and Ukraine already lost many battles. So supplying them with more weapons can really help Ukraine fend off the Russians.
Yeah, really, really powerful argument actually on the other side for why we should continue funding. Um, I really like the first point there. It's just that these people need that funding more than people in our country or in the USA or in Britain, for example, might benefit off the same amount of money, right? Because their situation is more dire, right? It's a more desperate situation. So this money could really go a long way for the people who are still getting their homes bombed, who are like losing their children or their parents due to the war and due to like, innocent people being killed. Okay, that was good. Let's hear from one more person. One more person. You can add an opinion to either side of this discussion. Okay, let's hear from JW or
Oh,
JW.
okay. Okay. So, I believe that the foreign countries should continue to supply war and equipment to Ukraine, because if they don't, then it shows that they'll turn a blind eye to genocide and sets a precedent for future conflict.
That's good. I like the point about precedent for future conflict. I think for sure countries right now need to like go really, really strongly against Russia and say your invasion of Ukraine is unacceptable, and if that at all can prevent any future conflicts, I think that's a really valuable thing, right? It's a really valuable investment, even though it could cost a lot of money. Excellent. Does anyone else have any thoughts they want to add before we move on? No, I think we've raised some really good points, so good job. We're going to skip past this research activity because I don't know how much time we're going to be able to have for this. But what I do want to talk about is also kind of the more recent developments. So despite very extensive funding, right, and military support for Ukraine, the war is still going on. And right now it's in a stalemate, which means that Ukraine could really benefit from more weapons. Now, as you guys have pointed out pretty, I think, persuasively, a lot of people don't necessarily want their own country to keep spending money, millions, billions of dollars to send equipment, to send support to Ukraine. And so while a lot of countries, a lot of the big countries like the United States or us here, Canada, were very, very supportive of Ukraine and donated a lot at the beginning of the war. As the war went on, and as it seemed less and less apparent that the war would come to a quick end, I think there's been a lot less support for the continued funding of Ukraine. So a lot of the West has not been able to provide Ukraine with fighter jets, which would be really, really helpful fighting kind of the air-based combat, right? Because if you are able to establish control over the air, this provides you with a massive advantage in the ground fighting as well. So Ukraine would obviously really love to have some really powerful planes, but each of those planes would cost billions of dollars to produce, and it's hard for Western countries to justify pouring so much money continually in. Now, another interesting development has to do with NATO. Going back to what we said, just a reminder, NATO is kind of this defensive military alliance formed between a lot of countries in Europe as a check, as a way to protect these countries against Russian aggression. Now, as a result of the Ukrainian war, other countries have also started moving towards trying to join NATO. In particular, Finland and Sweden, which were not formerly part of NATO, because again, look at how close they are to Russia, right? They didn't want to join NATO because they wanted to be neutral as to not anger Russia. But looking at the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine really pushed these countries to want to join NATO as well. And so we'll probably see sometime in the next few years that Finland and Sweden's attempts to join NATO will get approved and they will be able to join the alliance. Let's talk then now about the effects of the war. We briefly touched on these, but I think we can talk a bit deeper into the effects of war. I think this is something that is worth discussing, because it doesn't just apply to Ukraine, right? But there are many other humanitarian conflicts right now that have really, really deep impacts on people's lives. Does anyone want to give an example of, well, first let's talk about the effects that this war has had on society, on the people of Ukraine. What do you think some of those effects of war might be? Bessie, I haven't heard you talk in a while, so why don't you tell us something, what you think?
A bunch of people were displaced out of their homes because there's a lot of like destruction, there's food insecurity as well. It might impact other countries because a lot of people might want to try to immigrate from Ukraine to other countries because they don't want to live in a place that has a war going on.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else? Well, what do we see in the right-hand side? So I think Bessie gives us some good explanations about migration and the refugee crisis, which is what we see on the left-hand side. What about on the right-hand side? What's the kind
Uh,
of devastation there? Sorry, go ahead.
Bombings, destroying people's homes and the environment there. Uh, it's really destructive.
Exactly. And it's not just homes, right? What other parts or what other kind of buildings are really important for society? Like Hebe, or sorry, I don't know if I said your name right. Yeah, go ahead. You're still muted. I don't think we can hear you if you're talking. I think you might want to unmute Hebe. Can't unmute for some reason. Oh, okay. If that's the case, maybe could you just type your answer in the chat? Yeah, okay. So while we wait, we can move on to the next thing, which is an actual discussion about the whole refugee crisis. Now, we've already talked about other countries doing things like sending money, sending military equipment and aid. Um, oh yeah, okay. So really, really good. Hospitals, other institutions that help the public, like schools or government buildings. These are all. Oh, and you just amazing. Okay, you wanna say it verbally?
So the bombing could also affect places like hospitals and buildings that like serve the public and citizens, such as like schools or government buildings, because those are like necessary to function in the society and to keep the country organized.
Absolutely, right? Exactly. Also, like hospitals is a really, really big one. Russia has specifically targeted bombing hospitals because they realize hospitals are a really important part of Ukraine's society, right? And if you take out the hospital, this will cause a lot of damage. But this is also seen as incredibly unethical. It's a war crime to bomb things like hospitals because these are the places where innocent people are rely on, for example, to like get their injuries treated, right? Where really vulnerable people like mothers or children or even babies, right? Where they're trying to stay in these places to be protected from the war. So if Russia is just intentionally destroying these places, obviously that's really immoral. But it's unfortunate what they've been doing, right? As well as like schools and government buildings, right? These are really important parts of society, and like unfortunately in war, they just get caught up in the crossfire because everyone is just trying to destroy as much as possible from the other side. That's just how war works. So given all of these, effects, the harms onto society, given all the problems that we talked about, they're really, really awful. Well, it probably seems clear that other countries should accept Ukrainian refugees. But to what extent, right? Like, if I'm a neighboring country, do I need to accept millions of refugees that are coming from Ukraine? What if there are effects onto my own country as a result of us taking in so many refugees? So I think the discussion question here that we can talk about briefly is, should other countries be accepting refugees, and should they be accepting even more refugees than what they've already done? Yeah, currently. I think you're unmuted, so if you could just mute yourself, please, just so there's no background noise. Yeah, I'll just do it for you. Okay. Anyone want to start us off with their opinion? Again, feel free to just say what you think. There's no right or wrong answers. Alina?
I think that other countries should not accept more refugees for many reasons. First of all, many countries around Ukraine are not that wealthy themselves and might be going through economical struggles in the country and might not be able to sustain other people immigrating or running into their countries. And many richer countries farther away are a bit too hard to get just on foot or by like less expensive traveling options. And many Ukrainian people, like if everyone from Ukraine were to run away into like somewhere like Poland, it would really destroy their country's economy because a lot more people are looking for jobs. And even now, a lot of people are immigrating from poor countries to richer countries like Canada and the US. And it's really driving bigger companies to fire off batches of people. And many people that already lived in the country originally are losing their jobs because the amount of refugees that are fleeing in or just immigration that are coming into this country, and many of their own citizens might not be able to handle the stress of finding work, especially the younger generation, like the people in high school or in university might try to look for internships or jobs, and they might not be able to find any because companies are willing to hire people at lower prices because they just moved. So a lot of countries on their economy might fail if a lot of people try to um, move into their country suddenly.
Yeah, really, really great points there, I think, Alina. So yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else want to add to those reasons, or does someone else have a differing opinion that countries should accept more refugees? Let's hear from at least one more person, ideally two. Okay, Ethan, what do you think?
I'm not really sure. I think they should accept refugees because they can kick them out, like after the end of the war.
Okay, maybe the word kick them out is not the best choice here, but for sure, I think refugees will eventually be able to return to their home countries after the end of the war. Now, to be fair, we don't know when the war will necessarily end, but it does make sense that, these refugees probably aren't going to stay permanently like 50 or 60 years in these other countries. I think the war will eventually end, and they at that point they can return back, so population will balance out eventually. That's good. Okay, anyone else? One more opinion. Anyone? Okay, fair enough. Let's move on. So the economic effect. Now, we already talked about what the sanctions looked like before. These sanctions became much more extreme, and they started to have kind of backfire, well, they started kind of backfiring onto Europe and in the West. So, for example, when they placed more sanctions on Russia's oil, this led they this led Russia to stop the construction of its oil pipelines that would have delivered millions of what do you call it, like tons of oil or whatever, liters of oil to the rest of Europe, which is really important because you need oil for a lot of things, right? You needed to like heat your homes, for example. You needed to like produce stuff, for example, for cars, for that. So Russia basically cutting off its oil supply to the rest of Europe, that hurts Russia, but at the same time, that hurts European countries because now their oil becomes more expensive because they have to get it from other places and there's less of it. So it's a double-edged sword, really. Sanctions can also hurt your own citizens, but some people argue it's an important sacrifice to try to keep Russia out of the war as much as possible. So as a result of these sanctions, yes, it has damaged Russia's economy. Its currency, the ruble, has actually lost a lot of value compared to the rest of the global economy, for example. But Russia has still been able to generally fund its war. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think that even though the West has placed a lot of sanctions and stopped trading a lot with Russia, why do you think why hasn't Russia's economy completely collapsed? Why has it still been able to continue fighting this war against Ukraine? Someone want to take a guess? Ethan.
There's other communist countries that are like allies with Russia.
Absolutely, and they still want to trade with them. Very good. Andrew?
More specifically, China, because China has gotten a much better economy recently. So China helps support Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's great to point out China here. It's if you actually look at the news, Xi Jinping, the president of China, actually signed this strategic agreement with Russia. It's called the No Limits Partnership, and it basically said, "Hey, we'll still trade with you, and we're going to trade a lot of things with you. We want to sell a lot of things to you, and we want to buy a lot of things from you. We have a lot of things that we want." So China is obviously very, very strong economically. I think it's like the world's second strongest economy behind the United States. So the fact that Russia can still trade with them means Russia is still getting money that it can use to fund its military and fund its invasion of Ukraine. Now, does that mean that sanctions have had no effect on Russia? Probably not. I think the sanctions have still been effective in restricting Russia's access to a lot of money, but it just means it hasn't been 100% effective. And that's why the war has still unfortunately been going on. So let's talk about finally solutions. And the first thing we'll point out is what mistakes did Russia make in its war? I.e., Russia is a lot stronger than Ukraine, like Alina pointed out. So why didn't Russia immediately win the war? Well, they caught Ukraine really by most for the most part by surprise. But the problem with Russia is that it had really poorly trained soldiers, it had a lot of outdated weapons, and as they were losing the war more and more, their troops started losing hope. There was low troop morale, and their troops lost the motivation to continue fighting. But more than that, there was what's known as partisan sabotage. There were some people in Russia who were also opposed to the war that were trying to secretly sabotage or undermine the Russian war efforts to try to stop them from being able to successfully invade Ukraine. So all of those factors have led it to become a stalemate, right? And as Ukraine has also been getting more funding and military support from the West. But Ukraine at the same time hasn't been able to completely push Russia out of its country because Russia still has a lot of people, right? Even though hundreds of thousands of Russians have died so far, Putin doesn't really care. He's a dictator, and so he really only cares about himself and his own power. So even though he's realized, like, I'm probably going to have hundreds of thousands of more soldiers die in the coming years, should we continue this war, as long as I'm in power and as long as the Russian citizens are satisfied that we're fighting Ukraine, it doesn't really matter to him, right? Which is quite morally sad to see. But given that there's a stalemate, right, and we've kind of agreed that after 2, 3 years of fighting, Ukraine has not liberated itself from Russia, and still every single day, tens of people, hundreds of people are dying or fighting in the front lines. This raises the question: we need some sort of solution. What could be one of those solutions? Well, it could be for Ukraine to give up some of its territories as kind of a peace offering or a concession to Russia. So, for example, we learned that Russia invaded the Crimea in 2008. Some people have suggested Ukraine should just give Russia the Crimea in exchange for Russia ending the war and stopping the fighting. What do you guys think about this proposal? Do we think Ukraine should give up its territories in exchange for ending the war, or some of its territories?
I
Well,
think it's
yeah.
not gonna work.
Why not?
Because it's happened. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because it's happened before in the past, and it just, caused more conflict. Like, for example, the beginning of World War II, when Hitler was promised like some edges of Czechoslovakia in exchange for not expanding more, and then he just took over all of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, this is a really good historical example. So the idea of appeasement is not very effective, especially when you're like doing it to dictators who really don't care, right? Like if you give them this territory, well, if you give Putin this territory, you might argue that Putin will just take the territory and then later invade Ukraine again, because like what's stopping them, right? So the idea that this will actually just give Putin more encouragement and more confidence by showing that Ukraine is kind of like scared or feeling kind of weak, right? This actually could worsen the war and make it a lot more devastating. So this is a good argument. Anyone have any other ideas? Or do they want to also give more reasons for why Ukraine shouldn't give them this territory? Let's hear one more person at least before we finish up. Lena?
I think Ukraine probably should give up some of its territories, maybe not a lot, but because Ukraine will also lose a lot of soldiers, and since Ukraine's president is also probably a lot more considerate of their people, it might show more like we're not scared of you, like we are willing to give up more land, and this is just showing how your government is also weaker because you would rather take some of our land and leave us alone than actually fight us, and can also give them a chance to join that organization, so that next time they won't be attacked again by Russia. And it's just better for a lot of the people because a lot of people they're fleeing their own country, and it's just bad for the country in general because wars don't really benefit countries at all, especially the losing country. So this is why I think Ukraine should give up some of its territories to Russia.
That's good. That's a totally fair argument. I think one, the most important thing to consider are lives, right? Ukraine can have as much land as it wants, but at the point at which this prolongs the war and leads to more deaths, I don't think that's something Zelensky, who's the president of Ukraine, wants. Because he, like you said, he's not like Putin. He cares about the lives of Ukrainians. So if it is true that this will end the war earlier, and maybe it will, maybe Ukraine will be able to join NATO, and then in the future, Russia would be more afraid of invading Ukraine, then this is probably something that we could possibly push for. So really, really good contrasting perspectives there. I like that. So good answers, guys. What diplomatic measures can be taken? I'm sure you could probably guess. There were attempts, for example, between Ukraine and Russia to have some amount of peace negotiations. This didn't ended up actually happening. The deals fell through, and that's why the war was prolonged. But in other attempts, right, you could try to convince other countries to try to speak up to Russia. more or less, these diplomatic measures haven't been very effective, just for the fact that Putin is again a dictator that doesn't really care about how much this war damages Russia, because all he really cares about is continuing the war and trying to take over Ukraine, because he personally believes that Ukraine like belongs to Russia or something like that. Should Ukraine keep fighting? I think this is also something we would have discussed, but I think unanimously, we probably would all agree that Ukraine should. I mean, like, surrender is not a good idea here. You don't want to capitulate to Russia. Who knows what Russia's going to do if they were able to fully take over Ukraine? Pretty bad. And then some updates in the war. Right now, it's a stalemate. Even Ukraine's top military kind of commanders have agreed war is a stalemate. A beautiful breakthrough is unlikely. But despite that, Russia is determined to continue fighting. And that's for all the reasons we discussed about why Putin really wants this war to keep going, for personal reasons, for political stuff. Okay, great, fantastic. Well, with that, I think we've ended almost just on time. But great discussions here today, guys. Thank you to everyone who volunteered and participated. I hope you guys learned something about the war, the conflict in Ukraine. Keep yourselves updated because this conflict will see more and more developments. Maybe sometime in the future we will see an end to this conflict. I really do hope we get some sort of conclusion to the conflict. I mean, we stop seeing so many innocent people die. Great. That's the end of today's class. Thanks all for coming. Anyone have any questions? If not, you are free to go. I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys. Take care. See you next week. Bye.